Gosh, Pocket Ronnie made me enjoy eating triangles. So welcome back.
Okay, we're going to be doing quadratic formula. What is the quadratic formula? This is the quadratic formula. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. Great. So where does this come from? This formula actually comes from completing the square, and I will be deriving it in one of my other videos. So where do we use the quadratic formula? Instead of completing the square, someone discovered a pattern over and over, and they created a formula that you can use instead of completing the square to solve quadratic equations. So when a quadratic equation does not factor, you can use the quadratic formula to solve that equation. So remember that we said, okay, the form of your equation for a quadratic equation needed to be in this form before solving it. In other words, everything needed to be set equal to 0. Everything on one side is 0 on the other side. Remember, this exponent says we will have two solutions. In the quadratic formula, you can see we have the letters A, B, and C. So the standard form of an equation, before you can ever plug any numbers into the quadratic formula, your equation has to be in this form. It has to be in the form to where you have everything set on one side. Everything is on one side and 0 on the other side. So this is the standard form, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. This is called standard form before using the quadratic formula. What does a, b, and c represent? A and b are the coefficients in front of your x terms. A is the coefficient in front of the x squared term, b is your coefficient in front of the x term, and c is your whole number at the end. In the formula or in the equation I just wrote, this is your a would be 2 in this case, b is 5, and c is positive 10. Oh, it's very important. Let's just say that that was a negative, a minus 5x. Then b would be negative 5. The sign in front of the number stays with the number. So, how do you work quadratic formula? Alright, so we're looking at 12b2. The very first thing you need to do is to put it in standard form. In other words, you need to move everything to one side and set it equal to 0, and also put it in order of x squared, then x, and then your whole number. It doesn't really matter which side 0 is on. So for this problem, I'm going to put 0 on the left and everything else on the right. And I'm going to write it in order towards my x squared term, then my x term, and then my whole number. So now I'm looking for what is a, b, and c. This coefficient is a, so in this case a is 2. What coefficient's in front of that x? 1. So in this case b is 1, and then c is negative 7. Because your numbers in front of your coefficients and your whole number at the end are the numbers for your a, b, and c. Alright, so now we plug that into quadratic formula. What is a quadratic formula? I'm just going to rewrite it. If you write it every time, you will automatically memorize it. Quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus. This is where your two solutions come in. You're going to have this number plus a radical and this number minus a radical. So negative b plus or minus b squared minus 4ac, that's the square root of that, all over 2a. So now I'm just going to take my numbers, which is a, b, and c, which is 2, 1, negative 7, and put them in the formula everywhere that's appropriate. So x equals, starting here, negative. The formula has a negative sign, and then b is positive 1, so I'm putting in 1 for b, plus or minus the square root, b squared. b is 1, so that's 1 squared, minus 4 times a is 2, times c C is negative 7. It's important not to lose your negatives. All over 2 times A, and A is 2. So 2 times 2. Okay? Next step. There's nothing to simplify with that negative 1. So negative 1 plus or minus. I'm going to simplify everything under that radical. 1 squared is just 1. These signs are important. Keep up with your signs. Okay? I'm going to look at this as negative 4 times 2 is a negative 8. Negative 8 times a negative 7 is a positive 56. Here you can see you have a negative negative. 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times 7 is 56. And if you ignore that for a second, that would be a negative 56. And then that would be 1 minus it will look like this. 1 minus a negative 56. When you have a negative negative, it becomes a positive. So this is like 1 minus, this whole thing right here would be a negative 56. 1 minus a negative 56 minus a negative becomes positive. So that's how we get the 1 plus 56. All over 4. Next step. Okay, down here. So negative 1 plus or minus, I'm going to continue to simplify under the radical. 1 plus 56 is 57. All over 4. Now you look for, can I simplify the radical? And the square root of 57 will not simplify. And can I reduce all my whole numbers? Remember, that's like a 1 right in front of there. And I cannot reduce my whole numbers. So this is your final answer. This is 2 solutions. What this is saying, this is negative 1 plus square root of 57 all over 4. And negative 1 minus square root of 57 all over 4. Those are your 2 solutions for this problem. Okay, we're going to look at 12b-4. Remember, when you do quadratic formula, you want to have your equation in standard form. What is standard form? Standard form is where everything is on one side and 0 on the other side. But I would rearrange this to where it's in the order of x squared first, and then x, and then your whole number. Because your a goes with your coefficient of your x squared is your a term, your coefficient of your x is your b, so forth. So I would rearrange this. The sign in front of the number stays with it. So this can be rearranged just like this. Okay? So now we know that this is our a. A goes with the x squared term, b goes with the x term, and c is the whole number. So in this case, a is 4, b is a positive 3, c is a positive 2. Now we're ready to put everything in the quadratic formula. What is the quadratic formula? X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. You can actually sing you a little tune to that. Some teachers have done that. So now we're going to take this and put it back in. X equals negative b, and in our case b is 3, plus or minus the square root of b squared, which b is 3, minus 4 times a, and our a is 4, c is 2. All over 2 times a, and our a is 4. Now let's simplify under the radical. So we have negative 3 plus or minus a square root. 3 squared is 9. Minus 4 times 4 is 16, and 16 times 2 is 32. All over 2 times 4, which is 8. Okay, let's keep going. So we still have our negative 3 plus or minus a square root. 9 minus 32 is going to be a negative 23. Did I do that right? 9 plus 3 is 12. Okay, 32. So negative. You have a negative under the radical. What does that imply? Imaginary number. Okay? So all over 8. So now we need to pull this out as an I, as an imaginary number. So we have negative 3 plus or minus I square root of 23, and I cannot simplify square root of 23 anymore, so I can leave it like that, all over 8. So now I can look at, I can't simplify the radical, and can any of my numbers reduce? They can't. So these are our two solutions. So essentially what I have is negative 3 plus I square root of 23 over 8, and then negative 3 minus I square root of 23 all over 8. Those are my two different solutions, but it just can be written like this. Okay, now we're going to look at 12a10. We have this equation. It's not in standard form. Let's move everything to one side. I always like to try to keep my y squared positive, but it doesn't really matter. So, because even if your y squared is negative, you can use that as a negative 1 when you're replacing it in for a. But I'm just going to move everything to the left. So I'm going to subtract a 3/4 y and subtract a 2. So that means I have to do it to the left-hand side as well. The 3/4 y and minus a 2. So over here, those go away. So on the left, I'm putting everything in order. Y squared first, minus my y term, which is minus 3/4 y, then minus 2. Remember, I cannot combine y squares to y's or y's to whole numbers. Equals 0. Alright. Instead of working with fractions for your a, b, and c term, I would get rid of the fraction. How do we get rid of fractions? My only denominator is a 4, so I can multiply everything by a 4 in order for that denominator to go away, even the 0 on the right. Even though we know 0 times 4 is 4, 0 times 4 is 0, if you just get in the habit of writing it everywhere, then you've done a legal math move. So now what we have is 4y squared. Those 4's cancel. Do not forget your negative. Minus 3y minus 8 equals 0. Now, I like to label. That's my A, that's my B, that's my C. Be careful with your negatives. B is negative 3. C is negative 8. The sign in front of the number goes with the number. Now we're ready to plug it into the quadratic formula. X equals. Here's where you need to be careful. The formula is negative b. Negative b. We still write that negative, but instead of writing b, my b is a negative 3. Be careful. This first negative is part of the formula. B is negative 3. Keep up with your negatives. Plus or minus the square root of b squared. That's negative 3 parentheses squared. It's important to put the parentheses because negative 3 times negative 3 is a positive 9. Okay, so plus or minus, so b squared minus 4 times a, and a is 4, times c, and c is negative 8. Keep up with your negatives. All over 2 times a, and a is 4. Alright, let's simplify into the radical. Well, first off, let's go back to here. A negative times a negative is a positive. So that can become a positive 3, plus or minus. Negative 3 squared is a positive 9. Here I'm going to have a negative times a positive times a negative. A negative times a negative will give me a positive. 4 times 4 is 16. And 16 times 8, or you can do 32 times 4. 16 times 8 is 128. So 128 all over 2 times 4 is 8. So now keep simplifying into that radical. 3 plus or minus square root of 9 plus 28. That'd be 17, 3, 137. All over 8. And then you look to see, can you simplify this radical? I don't believe square root of 137 will simplify. And then I cannot reduce my whole numbers by the same thing. So this is your final answer. Essentially what you have is x is going to equal 3 plus square root of 137 all over 8. And then x equals 3 minus square root of 137 all over 8. Just so you know, all of these numbers can be turned into decimals. Square root of 37 is just a decimal. Then you add 3 to it and then divide by 8 and you're going to get a decimal number. But for now, we're going to leave these in fraction form. Okay, now we're looking at 12c3 and we have this equation. What's the first thing we want to do? We want to put everything on one side and set it equal to 0. So I need to add 6x here and I'm going to add it to my x's over here. You can only add x's to x's. Goes away there. So I have x squared plus 3x plus 1 equals 0. Now it's in standard form. Okay? Now, this is A, B, C. What is my coefficient for x squared? 1. So that is what A is. A is 1, B is 3, C is 1. And we're all positives. So now we're ready to plug into the quadratic formula. So x equals negative b, and my b is 3, plus or minus the square root of b squared. My b is 3, so that's 3 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is 1. All over 2 times a, and a is 1. Keep going. Negative 3 plus or minus, let's simplify under the radical. 3 squared is 9. 4 times 1 is 4, so 9 minus 4, all over 2. Keep simplifying under the radical. Negative 3 plus or minus square root of 9 minus 4 is 5, all over 2. When you get to this point, you look for, can you simplify the radical? No. Can I reduce any of my whole numbers? No. So these are my two solutions for x. Basically, my two solutions are negative 3 plus square root of 5 over 2 and negative 3 minus square root of 5 over 2. Our two solutions come from this plus or minus sign in front of the radical.